Today we're going to talk about sex and gender, and specifically we're going to talk about sex testing. This practice that happens in sport to determine whether someone is male or female, right, relying on this binary model. And that doesn't really happen that many other places in society. So we often think about the world in this binary, but it's rare that you actually have testing occur to prove which category you fall into. Now, this lecture is going to be a little bit more detail heavy and a little bit more science heavy than some of the other previous lectures that we had. And I think it's very important with this topic to get an understanding of what's actually being discussed. Now, my background is not biology, so I'm going to draw on people who are experts in this area. In particular, if you want to learn more about this topic, there's some very good articles by a biologist who often works with sociologists, and I believe her name is Katrina Karkazis. And I will, when I send out the lecture, I'm also going to send a link to her website. She does some really good writing in academic journals, and she's also published in more popular outlets. So if you're really interested in the science behind this, that's what I recommend. The other thing that I will tell you is there isn't in-class writing today. The in-class writing is going to be based on the Molly George article, and I'm going to get to that at the end of this lecture, and I will introduce the 4 questions that you have to answer. All right, so let's get into it. Now, before we go into the details of sex testing, it is worth thinking about what we just talked about, because this is going to relate directly to some of the issues brought up with this discussion of sex testing. So last time we talked about this idea of how sport becomes this authority about the body. It's a place where we think about what counts as a natural body, what counts as a fair modification of the body, and also raises questions of why we even care. So I was asking, should we allow PEDs and steroids? Why do we even care about this? If we do care, who should actually regulate it? Who should decide what's safe and what's not safe? Who to blame for people actually taking steroids, right? We know the immense pressure placed on athletes to perform. We know the immense rewards that one can get if they improve the difference between being a professional and being an amateur is sometimes just a few seconds or just the tiniest bit improvement in performance, being able to jump the tiniest bit higher, being able to shoot the tiniest bit better, being able to break a tackle a few more times. That's the difference between no money and a lot of money. And then once you are a professional athlete, the difference between being out of the league in a year versus 3 years versus 10 years can be the tiniest amount. So we know that pressure, right? But then it raises really key questions. What do we consider fair? What do we consider natural? What is just athleticism, right? What is this thing that mean that we talk about athleticism? How does it relate to hard work? When does it reach the level of cheating? If it is about fair play, we know there's numerous biological advantages that everyone accepts. If you're looking at elite athletes, there's going to be some biological advantages that separate them from people like me, right? If you're looking at something like baseball, people often have superb vision. That's necessary to be able to play the game. If you're a runner or you compete in pretty much any sport, it helps to have strong or big lungs, which could be just a biological advantage. It helps to have a strong heart, something you can work on, but also relates to the body that you're born with. It helps to be flexible. It helps to have long legs. It helps to be able to have certain types of muscle growth. It also helps to have money to access top training facilities. None of this is about fair play, but it seems that what we care about is maybe that it's natural, right? So even if it's hard work at a top training facility, it's still about how to maximize what we call the natural body. So we'll come back to this point. The other thing that I want us to think about, and I always return to this point over and over whenever we have these conversations, is maybe it's all arbitrary, right? What if we accept that? What if we accept that, all this talk about physical prowess and hard work, all those moral arguments, maybe in reality it's about a series of arbitrary and really socially determined rules, a kind of bizarre set of rules and regulations that enable sport to happen. And what is the true goal of sport? Maybe it's about entertainment. And if we accept that it's arbitrary, then we say, well, we're determining the rules that will tell the story we want about society, returning to Clifford Geertz and that model of society, right? We determine what we want sport to do for our society. And we determine what will make it more entertaining for us. Then maybe we treat sport as a privilege rather than a right. Maybe it isn't that every single person automatically deserves the chance for fair play and for a chance to compete. maybe it's about we come up with this arbitrary set of rules that tells the story of society that we want, that provides the things for society that we want, and then people have to fit those rules to be able to participate. Now, I'm not giving you an answer here, but it's just something I think about, and we have to be reminded of. This isn't there could be different rules. It doesn't have to be the way it is. So we get to determine what rules we want and why we want them, and that tells us something about society. All right, now let's shift a little bit to talk about sex and gender. So before we get into the case of Castor Semenya, who's probably the most controversial and famous case study that we could draw on, and again, here's an example. I'm telling you some of the people that you might want to read if you want more detail about this. So again, Katrina Karkazis or Karkazis is a key person in this area. Rebecca Jordan Young does some awesome work. Georgianne Davis is a sociologist who writes about the intersex population. And then Sylvia Camporesi, I'm not sure who that actually is, but they wrote this really good article, Out of Bounds, a critique of the new policies on hyperandrogenism in elite female athletes. So if you want to get into the science, if you want to learn more about these debates, these are the authors, these are the scholars to follow. Now, first, let's take a step back, and I think you've already probably heard these terms at some point in sociology or somewhere along your academic, during your time at Brockport or wherever you've taken classes, the difference between sex and gender. Gender is about performance. It's about the way we present ourselves. When we are born, the sex is determined, right? So that's the biology, the actual body that you have. You're placed into a sex category. So sex is the biology. The sex category is how you are labeled. In the United States, you are labeled either male or you are labeled female. So you have a sex, but then you're placed in a sex category, and then the gender is the performance that is expected based on that sex category, right? That's the social aspect. That's the thing that we can change across culture, can change as you grow older, that can change based on the historical period that you were born. It's how you're supposed to dress. It's how you're supposed to interact with other people. It's the activities you're supposed to participate in. It's the way you handle and display emotions, right? That's the gender part. There's certain ideas that we associate with being a man, right? This masculinity that's associated with being a man, and there's certain expectations when you're labeled as a girl or a woman, right? So boy has certain expectations, girl has certain expectations. That's the gendered performance that goes along with it. Sociologists all the time critique and deconstruct expectations around gender. However, here in sport, we're not talking about gender. We're talking about sex. We're saying, what is this biological thing that's going on? And so that's the important question we're going to ask. How does that play out when we look at sport, which is separated by sex, not by gender? It's based on sex, on that biological difference. So let's get back to Castor Semenya. In August 2009, Castor Semenya, who's a young South African runner, won the women's 800-meter race at the Berlin World Championship. She won by a margin of 2.5 seconds. This is a significant amount. For any of you who pay attention to track and field, for any of you who have competed, 2.5 seconds is a lot. That's a huge win, and this is at the Women's World Championship. She immediately found herself at the center of an international controversy. There was all the speculation about whether she was really a woman. And a lot of these questions were coming from the competitors. They were saying, look how fast she is. Look what she looks like. Look at her musculature. Listen to her voice. We're suspicious of what's going on. So the competitors are complaining not just about the large margin of her win, but on her appearance. One of the competitors just said, just look at her. Those type of people should not run with us. Right? So they're implying that there's something else going on. Word leaked to the press even before Castor Semenya knew that she would have to undergo sex testing. So these complaints come in. The International Association of Athletics Federation, the IAAF, which is this big committee that determines the rules for international competition, decides that she has to undergo sex testing. It actually gets leaked to the press before word gets to her, which is one of the horrible things about this story. If this is going to be happening, it should be kept private, right? The athlete should have the right to have this medical testing without anyone else knowing what's going on. Same as what happens if you're being accused of steroids, right? You get tested, but that shouldn't leak to the press before you find out. So there were all these headlines, including ones that like Time.com, Time Magazine had a headline that had the picture that I have here, and it stated, could this women's world champ be a man? This is happening before the test even occurs. So Semenya is reportedly subjected to a 2-hour examination. I say reportedly because this information about how the testing occurs is not made public, even though there's been lawsuits back and forth. She's reportedly subjected to a 2-hour examination during which doctors put her legs in stirrups and photographed her genitalia. Afterwards, Semenya sent distraught messages to friends and family. The test results supposedly indicated that Semenya had an intersex condition that left her without a uterus or ovaries and with undescended testes, producing androgens at 3 times the typical level for females. This is known as hyperandrogenism. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. So hyperandrogenism. So this is something she didn't know about, right? This is internal things happening in her body that she is unaware of. So she does not have a uterus. She does not have ovaries. She has testes, but they're not descended. So she's not aware, right? She doesn't actually know what's going on with her body. She was born and identified as female. She identified as a girl and a woman her whole life. And so there's this thing happening in her body that she's not aware of that is supposedly revealed during testing. So the International Association of Athletics Federation chooses to ban her from competition while it completes the investigation. This takes a year, and this includes 10 months of negotiation between her legal representation, between different medical providers or different authorities who have different ideas about how this testing occurs and what the results are. Eventually, she's cleared for competition. Her victory that we see above was allowed to stand, and as a result, she has to start undergoing treatment immediately. They say to continue to compete, you have to undergo hormone therapy to lower the amounts of testosterone that you're producing to a level that we deem okay, right? We'll come back to this in a little bit. So the first thing we need to ask is who gets accused, what do they get accused of, and what do athletes actually give up as the price of admission to compete in sport? So one of the things that's been found over and over in research, and the person, if you want to know more about this, that I would read would be Kate Henney, she's originally from rural Pennsylvania, which that doesn't matter at all, but she's from Pennsylvania. She's currently a scholar at one of the biggest research institutions in Australia, and she does a lot of work on sports and steroid and sex testing. And what she found is one of the things is women get accused when they don't fit the stereotypical femininity, right? So the people who get accused, you're more likely to get accused if you have short hair. You're also more likely to get accused if you're from a non-Western country. If you're not from the United States or Western Europe, you're more likely to get accused of doing something wrong. Even if the data doesn't back up that you're more likely to. So if you are someone from Eastern Europe, if you're someone from Africa, if you're someone from certain parts of Asia, you're more likely to get accused than if you're a white person from Western Europe. And so race plays a part of it, appearance plays a part of it. The other things that is key is when women are accused, when female competitors are accused, it isn't just of cheating, of taking steroids. The thing that gets stated over and over is they're not really a woman. That doesn't happen if you're a man being accused of a similar thing, right? Lance Armstrong was never accused of not being a man. That's not the accusation. It's that you're using performance-enhancing drugs. So it's interesting how it's the gender and sex that is questioned, not just the use of a performance-enhancing drug. So returning to Caster Semenya, we see her appearance constantly being judged, right? She's expected now to perform femininity and perform it for a certain audience, right? You have to show that you're feminine because you've accused of not being a woman. Winning confirms an unfair biological advantage. So even after she undergoes the hormone therapy, if she continues to win, which she did, that's a problem because then people will say, well, the hormone therapy doesn't matter. She's clearly still has an advantage, but every athlete has a biological advantage, right? So that's a challenge. And if she loses, it confirms that the treatment took away her advantage, and so her performance suffered, which means it was an unfair advantage. So she has to lower her testosterone through drug treatment. If she wins, it's a problem. If she loses, a problem. The other thing that's really important to think about here is her testosterone, her higher levels of testosterone, were through having a natural body, right? Before we were talking about this idea of fair play, natural body, she's not breaking the rules. She's not doing anything different to her body. She's simply training harder, and she has these qualities that she's born with that naturally allow her to produce more testosterone, which seems to help her performance, right? That's the point we're at. However, it's determined because of the binary model of sex, she's not falling into this category of female, so she has to modify herself artificially to actually lower her performance, to lower a hormone that is helping her. So let's think more about that, this idea of a binary model of sex. And this is where it's going to get even more scientific. There are at least 6 markers of sex determining whether someone is male or female. Now, scientists now argue there's more, but these are the 6 you always hear about. What are the chromosomes that you have? What gonads do you have? Hormones. Secondary sex characteristics. So that would be things like the hair that you develop as a result after you go through puberty. What are the external genitalia that you possess? What are the internal genitalia that you possess? These are the 6 markers. Now, the issue is none of these are strictly binary, and they don't always match up with each other, right? We like to think that's the case, but it simply isn't true. They don't always perfectly match up with each other. For example, it's assumed that people have either the XX or XY chromosome. That's what you learn in biology class. But some individuals are born with an extra X chromosome. Others have what's called a mosaic karyotype, where each cell has a different karyotype from another, right? So depending on how you're measuring the body, you could get different readings on whether someone falls on the male or female side. There's other people who are born, so there's women that are born with a condition known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. That's CAIS. So they're born with an XY chromosome, testes, and testosterone levels in the typical range for male. So by all these characteristics, you would say, well, of course these are males. We're looking at chromosomes, we're looking at gonads, we're looking at hormones. That's a male. Yet these women have complete feminine phenotype. They have breasts, they develop female typical genitalia, and they're doing that because their androgen receptors are not responsive to those androgens. So they have testosterone in their body, but their body's not reading it at all, right? So if you designate women with CAIS as male, it seems inappropriate because in every way based on appearance, based on how the hormones are actually used in the body, well, that doesn't make sense. They're clearly not male, they're women, or they're female based on that. But given that they're presumed at female at birth and raised as girls and overwhelmingly identify as female, it still doesn't make sense. But if you're going by simply the chromosome, the gonads, and what we measure in terms of hormones, well, that person will be designated as male. So you could see how it doesn't perfectly match up. This is much more complicated than simply a binary. And sex testing continues to be problematic because there's no single physiological or biological marker that simply allows categorization of people as male or female. A lot of biologists who study this topic have argued we could have 5 different categories. Anne Foster-Sterling, a famous biologist from the 90s and early 2000s, I think she's still doing work, argued that actually it makes more sense to have 9 categories, right? You would have a spectrum where on one end you have people who all these markers match up and actually produce a lot of whatever you're measuring. And on the other end, you have people with the different markers, but most people fall somewhere in between. Now, even if we hold on to the binary, right, which we do in society, we hold on to this binary, it's currently estimated that 1 out of every 1,000 or 1 out of every 2,000 people, right, depends who's doing the research and how the research is done, but it's basically agreed on that between 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000 people do not fit cleanly into these categories that we've created, male and female. So 1 out of every 1,000 or 1 out of every 2,000 people technically could be categorized as intersex. Now, that doesn't seem that common. 1 out of 1,000 isn't that common. 1 out of 2,000 doesn't seem that common. But when you look at the global population, that's a significant number of people. Now, most people are not even tested. These categories aren't even tested. All these things are not even measured, so we don't know where it would fall on the spectrum. But 1 out of 1,000, if you go globally, or 1 out of 2,000, a lot. By this measure, there's a lot more people who are intersex than there's people who are redhead or have red hair, right? By this measurement, you would have enough people who are intersex to, I think it's larger than the population of Russia, right? That's a significant number of people. Now, this is often very confusing, and it was when I first started learning about this, right? It takes a while for your brain to process it because we see the world in a particular way. We're taught to see this division. Sex is set. You're either male or female. It's gender that's more fluid. It's gender that you can shift your performance. But what the science tells us is it's not that easy to figure out the binary. In most cases, that doesn't matter. But in sport, we rely on this idea that we have these categories that determine where you compete and who you compete with. That's why so much science and so much money, so much effort is made to determine how to enforce these categories, how to determine where Caster Semenya gets to compete, right? Whether or not she's allowed to compete in those races. Now, there is a long history of different types of testing, of international committees, whether it's the Olympic Committee or other sports federations, trying to determine how do we say who gets to compete in the female division. There's never really testing for who gets to compete in the male division because the assumption is, well, the male division is the one with the higher level of performance, so who cares? Everyone gets to compete there. Now, you could be accused of something like performance-enhancing drugs, but in terms of a sex category, everyone can compete there. Let's focus on the testing to determine who is female. And this shifts constantly, and this is an important thing. This shows how challenging it is to figure out how to enforce the binary. 1930s and 1940s, there wasn't really a guideline, but you would actually get a certificate of femininity. So it could be things like hairstyle. Did you just simply look like a woman, right? So they would say, you look like a woman, here's a certificate, you get to compete. As more and more women began to compete in athletics, and as it got more attention, the IOC and the IAF decided we need something more scientific. We need something that is more objective, something that can standardize the testing. So this was known as the nude parade years. So what would happen is women athletes would have to be naked in front of physicians and in front of the committee that was in charge of this, determining who is a female. And sometimes it would include genital exams. Sometimes it would just include the person walking around. You could see that this is kind of a pretty brutal process to go through, right? You want to compete as a woman athlete, you have to get naked in front of this group of people. They were almost always groups of men, and they would look at you and decide whether they thought you were a woman, decide whether they thought you were female, and they could ask questions, right? They would look at, what are the hair patterns on your body? Are you hairier than we expect a woman to be? Do you have the development of breasts that we expect you to have? And if the group decided no, then you don't get to compete, right? So that received a lot of criticism. That only lasted 7 years, so it was determined that there had to be a shift to chromosomal testing, or the testing the chromosomes. That was seen, well, this will be more objective. We'll finally be able to determine without a problem who's able to compete in the female division, who competes in the male division. But the problem is, like I said before, chromosomes don't always match with every other characteristic. What if your body doesn't respond? Like the example I gave before, what if your body isn't responding to that testosterone? What if every other way you are identifying as female, you are labeled by society as a woman, but you have this chromosome abnormality, right? So that was, the science didn't work. Took almost 20 years for people to realize, all right, well, the science isn't perfectly matching up. So then they went back to the manual visual test. The committee, at this point, at least, it wasn't a parade in front of a whole group, but it was still a doctor saying, I identify this person as a female, they're able to compete. That, again, came under critique, right? Because it's hard to actually prove this. So there was a shift to an SRY gene test that was associated with the development of testes. I don't know much about that science. That lasted for a while. And then now what we see is it's all about testosterone. So we'll get to that in the next slide. What's key is in these years of testing, all these years from the 30s to the present day, only 2 men were caught trying to cheat and enter the women's division. So that is this concern that we hold on to, this idea that male bodies are going to try to take advantage of the situation by competing against females so they can have higher success rate. You don't see that often. We're not being caught. The people were being caught were all these people who had identified as women their whole life, who had no idea what was happening within their body, because we don't get these tests in other places, right? Why would you know what's happening internally unless you have actually someone test? Like how often do you have your hormones tested? I've never had my levels tested for things like testosterone. So you have a lot of people who get labeled as intersex, And these are tragic stories, right? You're someone who's competed your whole life as a female. So you've identified as a girl, you've identified as a woman, you've made it through the different levels of athletics. You make it to the national or international competition. Your body is called into question. Then this testing occurs and you're being told that you're abnormal in some way and you might not be able to compete. So in that New York Times article I shared, there's some real tragic stories who people have built their life around athletics. Suddenly they lose their ability to compete. And you have people who are told that they can't compete. And then 8 years later, the rules change and they would have been able to compete. But your whole athletic prime is lost. Your whole chance to make money, your whole chance to have some level of fame, your whole chance to test what you've actually devoted your whole life to, right? So there's some real tragic stories that happen. So the current policy is that it's all based on testosterone. Both males and females produce testosterone. However, female bodies typically produce about 1/10 the level of male bodies. So to compete in the female division, or what we often just refer to as the women's division, even though that's conflating, again, sex and gender, which we do as a society, to compete, the female body must produce testosterone levels below the normal male range. Now, there's a problem. Still, the people who are accused and have to undergo the testing are usually accused because their gender performance, right? The way they look. The other problem is who actually gets tested, which I brought up before about variations based on race, variations based on a nation. The other problem is testosterone isn't even a perfect measure. That varies by day and time, by activity, by mood, by a ton of different things, right? So if you train really hard, right after your training, your testosterone levels are going to be lower. So this was a question that happened all the time. I saw it a lot in mixed martial arts where athletes would intentionally get tested when their testosterone was low, and then they could get a medical note so they could get on testosterone therapy. And for a while, the league was saying, well, it's okay to get testosterone because something your body should naturally be producing, and it's seen as a medical condition to be too low, so they could get this note saying they needed testosterone, and then they could boost it to the highest levels that were allowed, right? So testosterone varies. And the other thing is, we don't actually know how the body reads testosterone. Bodies read it in different ways. Some people can react to the hormones in their body and take full advantage of it to produce muscles, to produce recovery, while others don't. Testosterone does seem to be linked to strength. We know that. It does seem to be linked to being able to put on muscle. But how that actually happens is still really difficult to understand. The problem with this is it's far over exaggerating the effect that testosterone actually has. So no study has shown that successful athletes are the ones that have more testosterone. We know it has an effect on the musculature that you put on, but when you do test athletes, for example, I'll go back to the example of MMA because they actually were testing testosterone levels. If you look at the people who are champions versus the people who are not champions, no relationship to testosterone, right? You often saw some pretty low levels in some of the champions. Maybe that's because they were training so hard. Maybe it's a whole range of other factors, but we don't really know exactly. It's not this one-to-one relationship. The other issue is nearly all the research is performed on male bodies. Male bodies, through the way they develop, are more likely to take advantage of that testosterone and to process it in a different way. So that's also a challenge. The other thing that we see is a difference in race times. The other place that there's been studies done, they do not seem to correlate with difference in testosterone between males and females. So there's a tenfold gap in the male and female testosterone levels. But if you look at the race times, much smaller gaps and much more overlap. So all this is saying that, yes, testosterone is real. Yes, it does have these impacts, but it's just not the same in every body. And literally every body, not every body, but every single body. So it doesn't have the same effect on how the body actually processes it. And it's a lot more complicated. So again, it's really difficult to figure out what the proper measure is. The other thing that we have to pay attention to is there's some serious health concerns when you artificially lower the hormone levels in the body, right? So when Caster Semenya has to artificially lower her testosterone levels, that could have impacts on her body. That could have impacts on her health. It's not always clear when, for example, a removal of gonads is appropriate. So again, we have to take into account, what are we actually trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of this? So is it about fair play? Right? If it's about fair play, this is a new addition to the rules, right? This idea that you have to have the exact same type of body. It's not about natural bodies because all these bodies are natural. It's about saying something else. We're going to have this binary, and the binary is what's enforcing fair play. It really relies on this deep-rooted discourse of protecting women from male bodies or bodies who are just not proper and correct. That anyone not fitting the strict binary has somehow taken an unfair advantage that's an abnormality and in need of a medical intervention, right? This idea that we're going to artificially change that body. So it's the forced scientific binary. It's saying there's this pure marker of womanness that all these athletes need to fit into to be able to compete. And if a woman performs at a level rivaling a man, must not be a woman, right? It's not just a doping accusation. You're actually calling their sex and gender into question. And again, we said this before, but there's numerous biological advantages that everyone accepts that are frequently found in groups of elite athletes. If a runner has some sort of mitochondrial variation that gives them extraordinary aerobic capacity and exceptional resistance against fatigue, well, that's a gift from the gods, right? If a basketball player is 7 feet tall or has abnormally large hands and feet like Kawhi Leonard, they're not banned from competition. It's celebrated, and the commentators talk about it all the time. If you have perfect vision and it helps you in baseball, that's not a problem, right? If you can just put on more muscle and you can recover faster from being injured, which you see happen all the time with elite athletes, that's not seen as a problem. But for some reason, this naturally occurring phenomena is seen as a biological variation that needs to be corrected, needs to be fixed, or you simply can't compete. That was a lot. It was pretty fast. There's some complicated science behind it. And again, if you're interested in this, I encourage you to read some of the articles that I referenced early in the lecture. They spell out the science a lot better than I do. They understand the science a lot better than I do. Now let's briefly shift, and I'm not going to take much time lecturing about this article, to Molly George's Making Sense of Muscle. And I'm not going to lecture much because it's a relatively short article. I think it's a pretty clearly articulated argument, and it's one that I think will make a lot of sense. So this is what the in-class writing is going to be about. Little bit of a shift from talking about the science behind sex, right, the determination of female category versus male category, to thinking about the challenges that women athletes face based on their gendered performance. So in this article, Molly George, who herself was a soccer player, is looking at Division I athletes who are competing as women. She focuses on soccer, and she's saying, so what does it mean to perform as an athlete and to also perform as a woman in society? So what I want you to do is work through 4 questions. First, what is the method that she employed for this research? Right? She's doing this as a grad student. I think she writes this paper as a master's, which is one of the things I love. If any of you are looking for a senior thesis, this is the type of project you easily could do in a semester or 2. This isn't that daunting, but it still reveals something really important. So first question, number 1 thing I want you to answer. What is the method that she employs? How does she actually do the research? And include who she's researching there. So what does she actually do? Second question, she finds that there's a challenge that the athletes face. There's this difficulty that the women athletes face, and she says there's basically 2 different types of bodies that are in contradiction or in tension between each other. There's a tension between them. So what is she talking about? What is the challenge that she sees the women collegiate Division I athletes facing? Third question, what is the source of correction? And what I mean by this is that the women athletes that are part of her study are facing negative backlash from different people. People are basically leveling some sort of critique at them. Who are the people doing this? Who are the people that they face some sort of negative response from or face a correction from when they don't present themselves in the way that's expected by society? So who are the people offering this correction? And then the fourth question, which is not in the article, what's important is, do men face the same sort of challenge? So if you are a collegiate athlete who is a man rather than a woman, do you face the same sort of challenge or difficulty that the women face in Molly George's research? So those are the 4 questions that I want you to answer for the in-class writing. So the in-class writing does not include this lecture that I just gave. The lecture that I just gave is going to be very useful when we talk about Title IX on Monday. So on Monday, we're going to look at Title IX, think about the value of Title IX, some of the challenges that have emerged, and we can also even think about whether Title IX still makes sense in the way that it's employed. So on Monday, we'll talk about Title IX. On Wednesday, we will talk about the coverage of women's athletics, right? There's this argument that the coverage, that there's less coverage because there's less demand, which kind of creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're going to look at, on Monday, Title IX, Wednesday, coverage of women's athletics. I hope that lecture made sense. Bring questions to class on Monday if there's anything that's confusing. It's a complicated topic that we covered rather quickly. But for the in-class writing, it's all about read Molly George, and answer these 4 questions. And we will start class on Monday by going over these 4 questions quickly. Then we will start talking about Title IX. So that is it. Hope you enjoy your weekend. Again, email me if you have questions. Bring questions to class on Monday. And get this in-class writing done before the start of class on Monday. So I'm giving you the whole weekend. Okay, that's it. Bye.